Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for attending the Getting Started with Azure webinar. My name is Damien Flynn. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center Technologies since 2011, and I'm also a Cisco champion since 2014. By profession, I am a consultant in Cloud and Data Center, DevOps, and serverless technologies, and I'm a presenter and trainer for Bright Minds. You can reach me online through my Twitter handle, emailing me directly, or using my LinkedIn profile. In today's webinar, we're going to take the first steps with Azure. We're going to see how to start working with Azure and spend most of the time in the Azure portal, in Visual Studio, and also from the command line. I'm going to also show you how you can keep track of your credits if you're using a free trial, and explain how you will be billed in an active Azure subscription. Before we dive in, I'd like to point out some resources we have for you. On the right-hand side of your webinar console, there are many links to different resources that we believe will be helpful to you to get started with Azure. Also, this presentation is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to everybody that's attended and posted on the website. I'm delighted to see we have a mix of developers and IT operation folks on our session today. That's just great. Let's begin with a demo of the Azure portal. I'm going to share my screen and begin by showing you how to get started creating and managing resources in Azure. The easiest way for us to start doing that is through the Azure portal itself. To get started with the Azure portal, simply navigate in your browser to azure.com, and on the landing page you have the option to log in to your portal if you already have a subscription, or choose the options to start a free trial. The free trial credits you with €150 or pounds sterling, depending on your region, with credit for your first 30 days, and a number of other resources are going to be available for you for a full 12-month period for absolutely free. At any point in time, should you wish to move from a free to a paid subscription, you can update your account. After you've logged into the portal for the first time, you will be navigated to the Azure dashboard. On the dashboard, you'll see the recent resources that you've been working with, the health of your environment, and of course, some getting started content and information. So let's take a look at the portal. On the left-hand side, you'll see there's a navigation pane that helps me browse my resources by their type. I see my virtual machines, my databases, or I can go back and see all of my resources. The list of resources on Navigator includes just my favorites. If I choose the option More Services, at the bottom, I can see the full list of resources that are available to me. I can also select to add some of these resources to my favorites. For example, take off my containers, and I can add my load balancers. I can also use the filter to search for any resource types that I am interested in working with, for example, MySQL databases, and also add those to my favorites. On the top bar, you'll find there is a setting area under the cogwheel, which allows me to choose the different themes and also set the language which I would like to work in. Additionally, I can always click on the question mark to show and hide the keyboard shortcuts, and I can click on the slash to get to the search options for all of my resources. Using the smiley face on the top, I can provide feedback about my experience with the portal, and the portal team is listening carefully and improves the experience consistently based on customer feedback. Finally, I have a notification pane that makes me aware of any changes since my last login, and also updates me on the status of my deployments that appears just below these icons. For billing and usage, there are several different ways we can pay for Azure. You might have signed up for a free trial account, you may have a monthly credit card through MSDN, or you may have consumption based on a subscription. If you're wanting to see your bill and usage, you can go to the billing session through the navigator on the left. On the billing information page, I can see my basic billing information, billing history, next and most recent bills, and a list of all my subscriptions. If I select a subscription, I can see how much I'm paying for each of my different resources by type and the burn rate. I can also go to the individual resources and see how much I'm paying and have been paying for each resources over time. So I can get a good visibility on where I am spending my money or my trial credits. If I click in on my keyboard or click the new link in the upper left corner, I can start creating new resources in Azure. I can scroll through the list of categories and select which items I'd like to create. For example, if I click on the compute, I can choose to create Windows or Linux virtual machines. If I wish to create a web apps from the web and mobile category, or I can also select SQL or NoSQL databases from the databases category. I can also open the marketplace and see a comprehensive list of thousands of items, not just from Microsoft, but from other vendors as well. These items can be provisioned or purchased. You can search through the marketplace or explore by categories. Currently, the marketplace has around 3,500 items from different vendors to choose from. Now, I'd like to create a virtual machine in the cloud. I can either search through the virtual machine images I want or go and browse through what's available. Azure has a huge gallery of virtual images to choose from. These are pre-configured virtual machines for things like SQL, Drupal, as well as a comprehensive multi-VM solution templates for larger systems like SharePoint and WebSphere. If you want to create a Linux virtual machine, you can search for popular Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Red Hat, and many more. But in this session, I'm going to create a Windows Server virtual machine. I have lots of different versions to choose from, but I'm going to choose Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition, which is the latest version of Windows Server. From there, I'm going to click Create and start the provisioning. First, we need to provide a name and choose the disk type we would like. I can either select to have an SSD, which offers higher performance and recommended for production environments, or select a HDD drive if I want to save a few dollars or euro. Next, I'll set up credentials for my virtual machine. The next piece I need to define is a resource group. A resource group are containers for multiple resources that are used for an app. In this case, since I'm creating a single virtual machine, I'll create a new resource group using the same name as my virtual machine. Now I need to select a location for my virtual machine. Azure currently has 36 regions around the world and currently plan to announce 6 additional regions in the coming weeks and months. I can visit the Azure Regions page to see a map for all the regions and decide which is the best location for me to deploy to. Since my customers are based in Europe, I'm going to select between Northern Europe and Western Europe, which is Dublin and Amsterdam. In the selection for the location, while creating the virtual machine, I see all of my locations offered to me and select my Western Europe region. Now I need to select my VM size. You should choose the right VM for your workload based on the number of cores, memory, disk drive size, and price. Azure will give you some recommendations based on popular sizes, but you can also choose the View All to see more options. I'm going to choose the D1 V2 standard image, which is going to give me 3.5 gig of RAM, a single CPU core. I simply click the select option and then I can move to configure some additional options for my virtual machine. For example, I can configure my networking by selecting my network segments, and if I want to make any additional changes. I'm going to leave these as default for now. Finally, I'll get a summary of the VM I'm about to create. I just simply need to agree to the terms of use and click Create. To save us some time, I've already created a virtual machine for this session. To get it, I can use the virtual machines link on my left pane, or of course I can use my search bar. Just click on my virtual machine, and in the details page, I can monitor and manage this virtual machine. I can look at CPU, its disk, and I can also open the activity and diagnostics logs to get even more information. From this pane, I also have the options of starting and controlling my virtual machine. And because this is a Windows-based virtual machine, I can click the Connect button, which will allow me to download the RDP file, which I can then open. I need to provide my credentials. And we now see the remote desktop of this virtual machine running up in Azure. Now, here we are in a brand new Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition virtual machine. I can configure this virtual machine like any other server in my own data center or in any other cloud provider. For Linux virtual machines running in Azure, I can also remotely manage these machines by clicking Connect and then copying and pasting my SSH command. And authenticating. I can see all of the processes running on my Linux machine, just as if it was running in my data center or any other location. So, as you can see, creating virtual machines in Azure using the portal is very, very easy. And in just a few moments, we were able to create resources in the cloud. When we create our virtual machines, I mentioned something called resource groups. I want to give you more context about that. If I click on the More Resources button again and go to the types of resources I can create and manage in the portal, you'll see that there are two types of virtual machines which I can create. One says Virtual Machines and the other says Virtual Machines Classic. Here's why. Azure has two deployment modes. The Classic deployment mode, which is the original model from the very first days of Azure. This model is centralized around the individual service and even API call that was made to create a single operation on a single resource. For example, create a website, stop a website. This model works well, but as cloud solutions have become more complex and are composed of multiple services, it became difficult to deploy solutions and configure each service independently. The more recent deployment model, which is now also the standard model in Azure Portal, is called ARM, which stands for Azure Resource Management. This model looks at the world through a resource group, which lets you group multiple resources and create or manage them together. As an example, if I look at the virtual machines which I created earlier and click on one of them, I can see that my virtual machine belongs to a resource group. Drilling into the resource group, shows me that it includes a bunch of other related resources: the virtual machine, the network interface, the hard disks, the public IP address, network security firewalls, and maybe some automation scripts for powering down the virtual machine after hours. All of those items were created as a single operation when I created the virtual machine. And if I ever want to remove my virtual machine, I can simply remove the resource group by using the option Delete Resource Group in the navigation for this pane. Additionally, I can also see the cost of each of the resources in this resource group. But more importantly, I can get a template that can be used to recreate this resource group. Resource groups can be represented using this template, which is just a JSON file that defines all of the resources and their relationships. Then I can use this template to deploy this entire group of resources instead of creating each resource individually. I can also get the code required to deploy this template for multiple programming languages and through the Azure scripting tools. This should give you an idea of why you're seeing two types of virtual machines and other services in the full service list, and why we are always associating resources to a resource group. So we've created a virtual machine and connected it to the portal. Now, I'd like to create and deploy a web application, but instead of doing it from the portal, I want to do this from my development IDE. Azure has SDKs in many languages and extensions to popular IDEs such as Visual Studio and Eclipse. Today, I'd like to create a web application and deploy it to Azure from Visual Studio. I'll switch to Visual Studio. I am using Visual Studio 2017, which is the latest version of Visual Studio, but everything I am showing here today is available in previous versions of Visual Studio if you install the latest Azure SDKs. I'm going to create a new project, and from here I'm going to create a web application for ASP.NET and turn on MVC. Visual Studio will take a few moments to scaffold the project. Okay, now we have a working web application. I'll close this and go back as far as Visual Studio. And now I'm ready to publish my application. To do this, I right click on my project and select the option to publish directly from Visual Studio. This displays the Visual Studio publishing dialog. From here, I'm going to select the Microsoft Azure App Services, which is the service that hosts web applications, mobile backends, and web APIs in Azure. Here I can choose one of my existing applications or create a new one. I'm going to create a new web app. I'll start by clicking the Publish button, where I'll provide the web application a name. Select my subscription. Create a new resource group, which is a container for creating multiple apps used by my application. Everything that I create for this app will be associated with this group. And I will select an application service name. Then I can click Create. Visual Studio is now working with the Azure Resource Manager APIs to create a new web application for me, to which I will deploy my ASP.NET application in just a few seconds. After the web app has been created, Visual Studio displays the Web Deploy dialog and populates it with some configuration for my Azure service to make it easy for me to redeploy my applications. After a few moments, Internet Explorer will launch and I should see my new application hosted directly on Azure websites. Let's go back to the Azure portal, where we can search for the resource groups that have now been created, and I can see my new web application resource group. Resource group has the web application and the service plan that we defined in Visual Studio. And if I open the web application, I can see my website service as well as the URL which it has been published at. The web application plan. This is basically a pricing tier of features that I'm going to pay for. I can see that I'm currently using a free tier. And if I move to the scale up options, I can see there is a full range of pricing tiers. For example, if I don't need strong compute power but needed to associate a custom domain for my website, I could choose a B1 tier. I could also go with the higher tiers, and then my resources are dedicated to me and not shared between several websites. I can also add SSLs, backup, load balance across multiple regions, and lots more options. But for now, I'll stay with my existing tier. I can close my pricing blade and navigate back to my website. I can use the shortcut for the URL, and again I can see my website is running perfectly up in Azure. If I go back to Visual Studio, I'll see that Visual Studio has now added a deployment profile to my project, which is information about the app service and where I'm deploying my application plan. So next time I choose to publish to Azure, all I will have to do is hit the publish button. Visual Studio has all of the information now saved to redeploy. So we've saw how to create a virtual machine through the portal and how to create and deploy a website using Visual Studio. Now I'd like to show you how you can script it. Azure has two scripting options. If you're a Windows user or familiar with PowerShell, Azure has PowerShell commandlets that lets you leverage the rich capabilities that PowerShell provides. If you feel more comfortable in the command line or are using a Mac or Linux, you can use the cross-platform command line tools to do the same thing. Behind the scenes, both Azure PowerShell and the Azure command line interface interact with the same set of APIs, so that the capabilities are very similar. It's just a matter of personal preference. Let's open the command line to see a few things we can do with the Azure command line tools. If I type AZ, I should see a list of all the commands which are available to me. There are two versions of the command line tools, version 1 and version 2. To use the version 1 command line tools, you will always start your command with Azure, similar to how you would using Git. To use the version 2 commands, you'll use the AZ command. We can log into Azure by issuing the command AZ login. The command line tool will suggest that we open a web page to the Azure device logon, which I'll paste in here. And on this page, we should provide the authentication code. Agree and provide our authentication credentials. After a few moments, we should see that a JSON response is handed back, and we are now authenticated to our Azure subscription. Now, we can start by creating a simple resource group, AZ group, create, provide as a name, 2017 DF, and a location, East Europe. Of course, if you make a mistake, Azure command lines will come back, and I will, in this case, update to a real data center, West Europe. After a few moments, Azure should validate my request and hand me back a confirmation in JSON format to tell me that it is successfully provisioning. Now, We'll create an app service, provide it with a name as well, 2018 DF, location West Europe, and the resource group that we just created, 2017 DF, and the SKU, we'll choose the free tier. If you have any mistakes in the command, Azure will come back and explain to you what your choices are. In my case, I have issued app service plan, which should really be defined as app service space plan. And additionally, your switches need to be properly escaped. 2 dashes for my SKU and then F1 for the valid size. As before, Azure will then check that the command has been issued correctly and pass the information over to the Azure Resource Manager. Azure Resource Manager will take that request, confirm its status, and give me some feedback on what it's created for me. Now let's clear the screen and create a web app. Again, we'll enter the command az web app create, provided a name, identify our existing resource group, and the web app plan we just established. They should respond a few moments later with another JSON payload, confirming again that Azure has essentially established a website for us. Now let's switch back to the portal for a moment to see exactly what we've got. I'm going to go back to my resource groups, and in the list of available resource groups, I can see the new resource group that I just established. Inside the resource group, I can see my plan and my website. And if I go to my website, I'll see that my website is published to a public URL. If I choose to navigate to the URL, I'll get some information from Azure telling me that my app service is up and running. That was quite easy. Now, before we finish, let's go back to the command prompt one more time. I'm going to clear my screen and we'll issue the same command again. However, we're now going to actually also provide a deployment source URL to an Azure template that has already been created for us. So I'm going to hit return on this. And Azure will now go as far as the deployment location, look for any ARM template or JSON, which we looked at a few moments ago, and take that setting to reconfigure our website. While Azure is running, let's switch over and take a look at what's sitting at this particular repository. Here I can see information about some web samples for a website that we are going to attempt to deploy from our command line. So again, after a few moments, Azure comes back and confirms that it has completed the configuration. I can go to my portal. I can refresh my views. And I should also be able to refresh my website that I just deployed. And within a few moments, I now have a fully up and running web application using the command line. I could have also done the same thing using the Azure PowerShell, of course. So let me quickly show you where you can download the scripting tools for Azure. Back on the azure.com webpage, I can choose the option More and head to the Resources tab. From here, I have an option to go to my downloads and can access my SDKs. And by scrolling down the page, I can also access my command line tools for PowerShell or this Azure CLI. Now let me switch back to the portal for a moment. Here we can see that our website is fully deployed using the app portal and app service plan that we created from our command line. I'd like to also deploy our web application, but this time not from Visual Studio, but from GitHub. To do that, I would actually need a repository on GitHub that has the web application that I wanted to deploy. We've just demonstrated that using the command line tool. But luckily, Azure has some additional samples that we can use. I'll select to go to the Azure Samples Git repository and let's search for some HTML samples. And I can select the HTML docs. Now, I'm going to grab the clone URL and then navigate back to my project in the portal, open my website and select the deployment options. Here I can see that a connection to GitHub was already created for the sample we deployed using the command line. So let's select the web application we deployed from Visual Studio. I'll open that web application in the portal and go to its deployment options. And this time I'm going to choose a source that I want to deploy from, select external repository and paste the URL. Click OK. And the portal will now process the request. If I re-click on the deployment options, I should see some status as Azure makes a connection to begin deploying my updated web application from GitHub. I can do this from any machine regardless of whether the command line tools are installed or if I'm using the portal or PowerShell. There are a few more things I can do with my web app through the portal. I can set up backups, scale it up, scale it out, configure custom domains, set up SSL, set it up for security scanning, and even visit a live console and explore my application in production, all within the rich Azure portal. If I'm a DevOps person and I want to keep an eye on the site's metrics, I can look at the charts. I can click on Edit to add more metrics that I'm ever interested in, such as a number of 200 requests, 404s, etc. I can even take this chart and pin it to my main dashboard and make a personalized DevOps dashboard with all the information I need for my running services. In fact, I can click on the Edit dashboard and customize the dashboard any which way I want. After a few moments, our deployment should have been updated to complete, and we should then be able to navigate and check out our updated version of the website based on the sources we've just deployed from GitHub. And there we have our new welcome page. So we've created a virtual machine, some web apps. Now we need a database. There are also multiple ways to create databases in Azure. You can either install SQL Server on a virtual machine to get full control over the configuration of the database. In fact, SQL Server running on virtual machines is one of the most popular things people do on Azure. Another way to use Azure SQL database services that lets you create your database in seconds without having to take care of any infrastructure or manage software updates. To create a SQL database in Azure, I can take the same approach we've seen before. I can create it from the portal or use the Azure CLI or PowerShell. Today, I'll do that from the portal. If I click New and select the database category, I can choose SQL Database. I need to provide it with a name, create a resource group for it. Next, I get to choose the source for my database. I can create my database as a new empty database. I can seed it with sample data or from a backup that I created earlier. This last method could be the easiest way to move your databases to the cloud. Just upload a backup and create a database from it. I'll create a blank database to start with. I also need to define a server that I'm going to use to host my databases. I need to provide it a name and some login credentials. This server will again be deployed to a specific region in Azure, and I can use this to hold additional databases that I plan to deploy later on. I also need to choose a pricing tier. As you can see, I can play around with the SQL DTUs and deploy SQL from as little as $5 a month or €5 a month for the lowest tier. A SQL database throughput unit is a performance measurement used by Azure. So as you can check out the different pricing tiers, there are numbers you should pay close attention to for the monthly costs of your environment. As your solution grows, you can scale your database and change your pricing tier at any point without having any single downtime. I'm going to go with this lowest pricing tier, apply the change, and then finally I can click create to start provisioning my database. Provisioning the database can take a few moments, and I can check the notification area in the portal to get the latest updates. Once the database is provisioned, I can start monitoring it. I can set up geo-replication, and I can also scale it to different tiers depending on my performance needs, configure security, and more. To check on the progress, I can click on the notification, click the actual deployment that's currently active to be presented with a blade that tells me the current progress, including its status, how long it's been running, and if I scroll down, I can see some of the choices that I provided during the initial creation and the different steps that the resource manager is currently executing in the back end. I can also refresh this to get a status update and see if any progress has changed. After a few moments, the notification area should update. I can also refresh the deployment progress to see that it is completed successfully. And I can also choose from here to go to my finally deployed resource. Dismiss the notifications, and I'll be presented with some information about my new database, including the current active DTUs based on the current timeline, some connection details of how to connect to my environment, the current pricing tier my server is at, and should I make that decision to scale up or turn on replication, I can simply click and use the map to turn on what locations I'd like to. I deployed this one to Europe West, so I can partner this with Europe North and set the choices of how I would like this to replicate. I'd like to be able to also connect to my database. So as I go back and look at the resource groups, I can see the SQL server that we chose to deploy, which is hosting my SQL database. And from here, I have the option of looking at the firewall that protects this server. I want to allow access to the server from my client machine. So I can simply click add my client IP address, and that will now be appended to my firewall rules once I click save. Firewall rules will be confirmed as updated, and now I should be ready to use my tools like Visual Studio to connect to this database remotely. Now, if I navigate to the overview of my server, I'll see the current configuration of my server, including the database that we just deployed. If I select the database, on its overview page, I now have the choice to connect to it. If I click the option Connect With, I can select Visual Studio, and this will relaunch my Visual Studio project. Visual Studio should launch in the background, and in a few moments I should have a connection back to my SQL database. Connection dialog is presented, and I'll now provide my credentials and choose the option to connect. My SQL Server navigator should then refresh, and within here I can see my new instance of Azure SQL databases, just as if I worked on any other local or database hosted in my own data centers. That's pretty awesome. So we created a virtual machine, deployed web apps, and even created a SQL database in Azure that I can then connect to from my desktop using Visual Studio, all with a few mouse clicks. This should allow us to start building simple solutions today using your existing Azure accounts or even your free accounts. To learn more about the different Azure services, there's a huge documentation section up on azure.com. From here, I can get high-level white papers for developers and IT operators that provide good technical overview to the platform, the services, and when to choose which services based on the scenarios that you're building. And if I click on the documentation link in the menu bar, I can browse through all the services and dive into their specific documentation. Additionally, in many cases, your solutions are going to be composed of multiple services. For example, you're building a digital marketing website. You may start with a website and scale it to different parts of the world using Azure Traffic Manager. Move your content to a content delivery network and stream video with media services. If you visit the solutions on Azure.coms, you'll find information you need in order to do just that. Here are some types of solutions that customers are building in Azure today. For each solution area, you can see some key technical benefits, learn about the core Azure services that help you, and some architectures from common scenarios. For example, if I'm interested in building a website using Umbraco content management systems, I can get an architectural diagram that shows me all of the services I need to use. I can also from here see things like estimated pricings and templates that will allow me to get started quickly, along with all of the rest of the related documentation that may be appropriate for my solution. If you're beginning to think about deploying Azure for production services, then another useful page under support is of course the status dashboard that shows you the health of the platform and if there are any known issues for services or regions. We all know that every software has bugs and hardware might fail. So if you're seeing something that looks odd or something isn't seemingly working correctly, I suggest you go to this page and seeing if there's anything going on. And as you're going through the phases of testing out technology, all the way to running production workloads in the cloud, you might want to consider getting some level of support. If you're a free trial, billing and subscription support is included. The developer support plan is great if you're playing around with the technology and need assistance. The standard, professional and premier support plans are best suited for production workloads. They have faster response times and a better product coverage. To open a support request, simply go to the Azure portal, click on the Help button and start the process. In this session, we took the first steps with working with Azure. We talked about your new Azure account. We showed you how you can explore the platform. We used the Azure portal to create and manage resources. We created virtual machines, web applications, and SQL databases, and talked about the basic concepts such as resource groups, database throughput units, and more. We also deployed a web app from Visual Studio and saw the tools and integration that we have for Azure inside the integrated development environment. We used scripting tools such as the Azure command line interface and Azure PowerShell to automate tasks such as creating a new web app so we can deploy it from GitHub. We also talked about growing your solution and how you can find useful resources on Azure.com for both support, architecture, and more. We've reached our time limit and need to bring the session to a close. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today and hope you've really enjoyed seeing Azure in action. Keep an eye out on Azure.com for additional Getting Started webinars. The recording for today's presentation should be available within 40 hours and you'll be getting an email about that. Feel free to contact myself. My contact details are at the start of the presentation. But otherwise, thank you and have a great day.